Hey guys, so I'm just making this video because I wanted to address some common concerns that I had regarding the reliability of my pumps and whether or not they're going to last. And one person in particular said that I should put thousands of hours on my pump to test its reliability so that I can verify that it's going to hold up in the long run. But I want to explain why I don't need to do that. These pumps already go for thousands of hours before they all inevitably fail in the same way. That reason being is the O-rings on the pumps. And to really understand how to prevent that from happening, you need to understand why it happens. And the reason why it happens is because the factory O-rings that they use simply can't hold up to the exposure of ethanol. You can see here they put some kind of coating on it that starts to come off and flake off, and when that happens, it really compromises the integrity of the O-ring itself, and it can no longer seal. So when this O-ring can no longer seal, it lets fuel go past because this side of this bellow piston is exposed to fuel, and this side of it deals with hydraulic fluid. So when the seal itself fails, you get a contamination of fuel inside of the hydraulic fluid, and that causes a whole cascade of other failures, which I also address, but I'll get more in on that later. I'm simply replacing the O-rings with a more ethanol resistant O-ring that can withstand exposure of ethanol, even E100, without degrading. And it really shouldn't be a problem in the long run because the mode of failure is predictable. It's the O-ring degrading. So because I'm replacing it with a better O-ring that's not going to fail like that anymore, then the pump really shouldn't have any more reason to fail. It really just boils down to the fact that BMW made a solid pump. They just cheaped out on the O-rings. Whether or not they were engineered to actually fail or not, I can't say for sure, but the evidence would point to it, because if you think back to early 2007 when the pumps were first released, they were starting to have failures left and right after 6 months or a year, where they were having to cover the cost of these pumps. And I don't have one of the original pumps to show you. I've since thrown away, but I did note that they had a different color O-ring inside of the pump, and all of the newer pumps seem to have this O-ring with this yellow coating on it, whereas the older pumps, it was more of an orange color O-ring, and it was solid orange all the way through. So I think BMW recognized that, and they changed up the O-ring material for something that would last just long enough to outlive the warranty, but at some point would still fail, causing the customer to have to foot the bill for a new pump when it's no longer BMW's responsibility to cover it again. So more on some of the modes of failure that occur as a result of the pump initially failing due to the O-ring failure. When the hydraulic fluid itself becomes contaminated with fuel, it actually compromises the retaining compound that holds this accumulator in. And I've still seen this accumulator come off and lose its hydraulic fluid even when the pump didn't have an O-ring failure. So what I'm doing is, after I initially clean and ultrasonic clean the pumps, I'll knock these accumulators off. So it's a little bit hard to see, but there's actually a small groove in there where they're relying on sort of a better mechanical bite for the retaining compound. And the newer pumps actually have 2 grooves in them, whereas the older pump bodies have a single groove. But I scrape all that out with a pick tool to make sure that that groove is clear and free for new retaining compound to rest inside of. And then I have to let this stuff cure in absence of air under vacuum for 24 hours before I can do anything else to the pump and start thinking about filling it or degassing it and exposing it to fluids. Another second line of defense is I put some JB weld around the pump body and the accumulator body just as a second line of defense to make absolute sure that this accumulator is not going to pop off or leak. Something else that I'm doing to the pumps, and it's more a result of my previous attempts at rebuilding pumps. I was using the wrong size shaft seal. It was a little bit too tall. So what was happening was it was catching on this part of this rotor head, and it would inevitably cause it to grab and walk the seal out, and it would leak. And it's overkill. I've since got a new batch of shaft seals that's more dimensionally close to the factory seal, and it doesn't have a problem catching on this rotor head. But I'm still doing this method just as an extra line of defense, just to make absolute sure that it's not going to be a problem. I use the same retaining compound to seal them in, and the same thing with letting it cure under vacuum for 24 hours. But additionally, more than that, I'm putting these stakes into the sides of the pump body to ensure that this seal isn't going to walk out and it's not going to be a problem again. Something else I kind of want to cover is the piston bellows, as I call them. Pre me degassing them, basically when I was initially trying to figure this out, I was just going off of other people's attempts and sort of copying what other people were doing. And one of the methods that other people were doing were they were submerging the pump and they were assembling it under the hydraulic fluid to try and prevent any air from being in the pump body itself. But when I tried that, the pumps wouldn't last very long, and I ended up seeing these actually start to develop cracks. So my theory is that air in the pumps was causing cavitation, which is basically micro explosions, which was compromising the integrity of these piston bellows and causing them to fail prematurely. Basically, post degassing the pumps, I haven't seen a single bellow crack, whereas before, when I was doing the submerged method and not vacuum degassing the pumps, I was starting to see these things crack. They wouldn't last very long, and I was trying to figure out why I was suddenly seeing these things start to crack. And my conclusion was that it was the cavitation causing that issue. So since I started degassing them, I haven't seen them fail again. And it's pretty indicative that it was in fact the cavitation that was causing them to prematurely fail like that. So that's why I feel pretty confident that this shouldn't be an issue. I really believe that these were vacuum degassed from the factory. The extent to that, I don't know for sure, because it takes me 5 hours for the air to completely evacuate out of the pumps and for it to stop bubbling. And I have to do it a different way than the factory. I'm having to have the case partially split open with the pump submerged and letting the air come out from between the two case halves. And then after that's done, then I'll put vacuum on this diaphragm to about 20 inches of vacuum, which pulls the rack travel to about 90% of its full travel. Because if you go to full travel, then when the pump gets hot and the fluid expands, it has nowhere to go. And I think that was also one of the issues that contributed into why the accumulator would want to pop out or why the shaft seal would want to pop out. So I'm only pulling them to about 90% of their rack travel. But that being said, the other job of this accumulator is it needs to have a constant positive pressure on the hydraulic cavity to prevent air from ingressing, because inevitably these shaft seals are not, they're not 100% sealed, because you have something spinning around inside of there. It's going to be an extremely slow leak, and it'll take years for it to actually leak out, but it needs to have that positive pressure on there, so to speak, to prevent air from ingressing into the pump. And any air, like I've said it a million times on all my videos, that the pumps can compress air. They cannot compress hydraulic fluid, and air is the enemy of these pumps. But going back to the vacuum degassing part of it, I have my suspicion that they're factory degassing them, because you can see this taper fit. It's almost like they had sort of relying on how AN fittings seal. You can see that it fits into there. So I have a suspicion that that's how they were filling the pumps and then pulling vacuum on the pumps to essentially make sure all the air was trapped out of it. And they probably had, after all was said and done, a preset pressure to preload these diaphragms rather than vacuuming it. But because I don't really have access to get this ball out, I have to sort of work around doing it in a different way to achieve the same outcome, if that makes sense. And this is among the few parts that I can't really put a warranty behind, but I can say pretty confidently that it shouldn't be a problem as a result of anything that I'm doing, based on my observations and my experiences rebuilding these and actually having it last. Another thing that I can't really I can't warranty or be held accountable for is the internal check valves, and they're sealed behind this welded little cover, and I simply can't even look at these, let alone service them in any kind of way. The best thing that I can kind of do is to just verify that the check valves are in fact only allowing fuel to pass through them one way and not leak back. And from what I can tell, there's always gonna, they're not going to 100% seal even on a brand new pump, but to some extent they're supposed to hold fairly well and prevent. So I can't really warranty that. But that being said, if that does happen, if your pump does happen to experience that failure, especially before the 1-year warranty that I'm offering on these pumps expires, I'm still going to work with you and not charge you full price to get you going again with a used replacement body. If these parts were something that I could source new and service, I would absolutely be doing it, but there's just simply no source to buy these bellows new, and there's no way to even access these to start to extrapolate how I would service them or refurbish them or replace them. Another thing I wanted to address and sort of talk about is my verification method to test that the pump is working and performing as it should, because someone commented on my video about me pressure testing the pump, and their concern was that it might build pressure, but it might not be able to keep up with the volume of fuel flowing. And I sort of get where they're coming from, but at the same time, it doesn't apply to this, because you really have to understand the way that these pumps work, and they're not really pumps at all. They can't move any fuel on their own. They absolutely 100% need to be force fed with fuel in order to multiply that fuel pressure and send it out of the high pressure outlet port. So basically what's happening is your low pressure pump or pumps are supplying your volume of fuel, the actual amount of fuel, and it force feeds into the inlet of the pump, and it goes through some one-way check valves that only allow fuel to fill up this cavity. when that cavity is filled with fluid, you have your hydraulic bellow, and when your swash plate comes around, it pushes on this plunger. And because there's hydraulic fluid inside of here that is incompressible, it causes this bellow to expand out. When that bellow expands out, it's squeezing the fuel and ramping up the pressure, and that pressure has nowhere else to go except out of your high pressure outlet. And that's how the pumps build pressure. That's why I say that they're not pumps at all, they're fuel pressure multipliers. So you only really need to verify that the pumps are in fact building pressure to verify that they're working. They're not going to be able to make pressure and not flow the volume. It just simply doesn't work that way because it's not a pump at all. I also want to say that I really started this off not with the intent to capitalize on it, but as someone much like yourself who is decently good at doing stuff themselves and doesn't want to spend an arm and a leg to get up and going again. And I really just wanted to figure out if this is something that I could do for myself and spend the least amount of money possible doing it, after replacing my fuel pump with a used pump, having it last a year, and then that pump failing, and then replacing it with another used pump which lasted 3 months before it failed again. And that's what really led me down this path of trying to discover if this was something that I could do myself, and if this is knowledge that I can share with the rest of the community for other people to do for themselves. It ended up turning into a very involved process where you need to invest in some things like the degassing machine and the ultrasonic cleaner, and it's just a really advanced level kind of do-it-yourself thing. Like on this bellow in particular, again, going back to just sort of copying what other people were doing, one guy was using these paint can cap removers to physically pry this out, and that was damaging and bending the metal on these bellows, so it made it unusable. Like you can't reuse this and expect it to actually hold up and live, because the metal's been fatigued in a way that it's not really meant to be. So I had to develop my own methods for safely disassembling these things without damaging anything. I had to develop my own tools to actually remove these piston caps. I've seen people, and this is an example of that, I've seen people simply taking a punch and backing them out that way, but you get little shavings of metal that almost come off, and I didn't like that at all. I didn't like the idea of little shavings of metal in here when you have a very, very tight tolerance part like this, and you have a swash plate going over it, and then you have a bearing inside of this for the swash plate itself. It just didn't seem like a good idea for me. So it's not like I'm saying people can't do this for themselves. It's just they either need to just happen to have everything that I have to do it, or invest in the stuff that they need to do it that they don't have yet. And when you really start factoring in the amount that it's going to cost you to invest in all this stuff to really do it properly, and you consider, like my experience, and I'm sure most of you have also been in similar instances, like where you bought 2 used pumps and you're in it for $500 and you have yet again a failed pump that you're dealing with. Well, I'm charging $500 to rebuild these things, so it kind of makes the most sense just to go with me to begin with. And that's what I'm really trying to emphasize to people, that it's really just your overall best bang for the buck, and it makes the most sense from a reliability standpoint, from not wanting to have to deal with it anymore, and from a financial standpoint. So I hope that this video helps you make an informed decision and clears up some of the concerns or misconceptions you might have had, and gives you a better overall understanding of how these pumps work.